So thank you for coming today. We'll get started within our active teaching lab. Just by way of announcements, we are, depending on if we have enough time at the end, we will be doing an activity. So one, Chris will be leading, and that's what that front sheet is for. And the second one, you'll need to log in to the Active Teaching Lab Fall 2019 course. That's the gray one in case you were here last semester as well. I have login instructions on the back if you haven't ever logged in before to that. You just go to the URL and then you'll be automatically signed in as a student, so you'll be able to do the activity today. So that's the Active Teaching Lab Fall 2019 course. It's the gray one. Also by way of announcements, after a long delay, last week we came out with the full schedule for the semester, so that's all ready to go. So there's a handout that's on by the sign-in sheet over there, so the full schedule is available. So that's all there as well. And just want to throw another shout out to the Teaching and Learning Symposium. That's going to be coming up this January 9th, 2020. We'll be talking about achieving equity in the classroom. So you can go to uwm.edu/teaching-learning-symposium and learn more about that there. If you are interested in submitting a proposal, the proposals are going to be due by October 15th, so I think that's next Tuesday. Thank you, Bill. Next Tuesday. And then registration, the deadline is December 15th as well. So registration and proposals both at uwm.edu/teaching-learning-symposium. The Teaching and Learning Symposium. We are hiring graduate workers, so if you have anybody that you think would be likes technology and loves teaching, have them go to uwm.edu/CETL to get started. So we are hiring graduate workers. All right. Finally, as always, Kathy Pinkowski is sitting up in front, so if you have any questions or concerns and you're online, please just go to the Active Teaching Lab YouTube channel that we're on right now and you're watching to ask her questions, or if you're here, feel free to raise your hand and she'll be able to help you out, or I'll be able to help you out as well. Also, if you have any teaching and learning questions throughout the week, Kathy, and you're in the College of Letters and Science, Kathy would be able to help you out. Otherwise, you can certainly contact CETL as always. So, today we're going to talk about student podcasting with Christopher Cantwell. And just as a brief introduction, Christopher graduated from Cornell with a PhD, and his research is in religion in America and evangelicalism and fundamentalism. His teaching interests lie in public history, digital humanities, and religion in America. And today he's going to be talking about the student podcasting assignments that he has in his classes. So, Christopher, welcome. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, and as much as I did my grad work in upstate New York, actually got my undergraduate degree from the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. I'm from just outside Beloit, so I've only been here a couple of years now, but part of the reason was to try to get back closer to home, so it's exciting to be here. So, we in the slideshow here? There we go. Okay. So yes, as Lane mentioned, thanks everybody for coming out so early in the morning to talk about this. Although this is kind of what gets me up. I listen to the Daily on my walk over here, so I've already consumed one podcast. And what I'd like to talk about today is a little bit about sort of my story of how I got interested in podcasting as a classroom assignment and sort of a framework to build a coursework around. And then show you a little bit about how I've integrated podcast into non-podcasting courses, so like classes on history, how I've had final assignments be podcasts, and then sort of what I've gained from that, and also the kind of extra headaches that can come along with it sometimes, or just lessons I've learned, I'll put it that way. The story of my engagement with the medium goes all the way back to the early 2000s when the final years of my graduate program, as well as for about 5 years after my graduate work, I worked at a museum in Chicago for a long time. I got a PhD in history, but was always interested in the variety of institutions in which history is told. My first job was at the Wisconsin Historical Society here after college. And at the time, I was working at the Newberry Library in Chicago, where I worked for about 8 years, and I had an 8-mile bike commute one way, which was amazing because I was in the best shape of my life at the time. But on the way, it was right about the moment that podcasts started hitting sort of a level of popularity, and I kind of what passed the time while I was riding my bike, because I would just listen to shows as I went to and from work. And for one thing, I just loved the medium, but then I also realized that I was like learning things about my field, that I noticed other historians engaging in the medium. I noticed other sort of journalists in the expanded space of a podcast taking on topics within the discipline of history that likely never would have been aired in broadcast spaces, but because of the low threshold of entering a podcast, you now had sort of niche shows about the history of Kansas, right? Like you could have like these really deep dives into local corners of the world. So when I finally re-entered the academy through public history, which is my position, I teach sort of students who aspire to work in museums, library, and historical societies. I was really keen on making podcasts like a central part of my teaching portfolio. And for me, I did it for a couple of reasons. I mean, first, as I was mentioning earlier, is that we are in the midst of a kind of an audio bubble right now. When I first got the first report came out when I first got my first teaching job, that a quarter of all Americans now listen to at least one podcast a week. As of last year, that number is up closer to 40% now, that people are about a third of the US are listening to at least one podcast a week. So we're at a moment where this is kind of a critical awareness in mass, that like if you were to do a project like this, your students are likely to be familiar with it in one way. The other reason I took this on is just because I think it's pedagogically relevant. For students who are going into the workplace now, they're going to have to be critical consumers and producers of this kind of content. And I think it's incumbent upon us as instructors to work in a medium that is of interest to them and that is relevant to them. I mean, so a colleague of mine in the museum world compared podcasts to the websites of the 2000s, right? So in the 1990s, all of these museums were saying, when are we going to get our website, right? What are we going to put on our website? And now institutions are having that same conversation about podcasts. And the last thing kind of relates to that is that I think we're all digital humanists now. Like we are all teaching with technology. I think in all of the disciplines that we do is now mediated by some sort of technological interface or platform. And so I really think because it's a part of the work that we do, that we should make students a part of that process, right? Even if they're not making podcasts, I now try to include them in the readings for the week, just because that's how I keep up with the field, like listening to these things. And so to show them the ecology of the disciplines that we're a part of, I think is important. So with this kind of conviction, how I then kind of got myself prepared, having not been trained in broadcast journalism in any way other than riding my bike to and from work, the three ways I really sort of became kind of an autodidact in this medium was, one, just by consuming and by seeing what people do, and then trying to sort of think about how I could apply it to my own needs. The other really thing in sort of becoming a consumer of podcasts is there is a great number of podcasts about podcasting, right? These like meta shows that are incredibly helpful in terms of just getting yourself up to speed. And I've provided a couple of the examples in the resources we can talk about. The other big thing I did is I actually sought out training in doing this. So I attended a Transom Traveling Workshop, which you can talk about, which is a nonprofit that teaches audio storytelling to people. And it's a 1-week seminar that I found incredibly productive. And I used some of my startup funds to go do this. And then the last thing is, being in academic institutions, we often have radio stations attached to us. And I think we can lean on those relationships. So when I was in Kansas City, the university I worked for chartered KCUR, and here WUWM is a part of us, right? They have UWM emails. And I think we can leverage those relationships and just surround yourself with smart people like my colleague Jane, who is a broadcast journalist, and she kind of lean on her and learn from her experience. So that's kind of how I arrived at feeling comfortable to sort of put this into a class. And so the context of the class that I'm going to talk about is a class I developed here called Podcasting the Past, Audio Histories of Wisconsin. And so this class really kind of tries to strike a balance between content and medium, if you will. So it's a class that the history department had on the books for a long time, just on the history of the Midwest writ large. And so I thought, being a local history class, it might be an opportunity to dive into sort of doing local focused storytelling. So the class, as I said, was sort of a history of Wisconsin, from sort of native peoples to the present, focusing on sort of long terms and trends. But as opposed to exams or research papers, what I then had students do throughout the course of the semester is everything was building towards them creating what I call a 5-minute piece of audio scholarship, right? And I think calling it audio scholarship was important to me, that even though we are moving to a new medium, that it's not going to be a paper, that doesn't mean it's any less serious, it's less rigorous or less researched. And so the challenge was how to maybe sort of prime them to work with tools they've maybe not used before, right? I think sometimes we sort of assume the English department has done the work for us in teaching them how to write papers and then just say write a paper. But I didn't want to make that presumption. I sort of wanted to show them how to do the work alongside of learning the content. And so the challenge was me just trying to strike that balance, that so we were able to do both during a week as well as sometimes during individual class sessions. And so what I'd like to sort of focus on today, sort of the rest of the time here, is showing how I try to scaffold my class so that students feel prepared to make a podcast by the end of it. And for me, it really comes through 3 assignments that sort of that they build up to be comfortable using tools. And each of the assignments is related to one of the tools that they use. But then, as you'll hopefully see, I sort of challenge them to use the tools, just sort of do the research that they're doing, right? So that it's not just like, hey, learn how to use a recorder. It's, hey, learn how to use a recorder and then learn something about the stuff we're talking about. So maybe that'll make sense if I just start. So these are built out over the course of the semester. We do about 1 every 5 weeks. So excuse me, I have 1 every 3 weeks, because then they have the remainder of the semester to go out and put everything together and make it. And the first one, assignment 1, is just built around teaching the students how to use the recorder, right? They literally have equipment they may not have encountered before, handheld recorders, microphones, in addition to the software, which we'll talk about a little bit. And so the first assignment was a way to just get them handling stuff so they felt comfortable about it later, as well as then building that around a theme of either their research topic or the class. So one of the things I've had students do before is what's called a vox pop, which stands on the Latin sort of voice of the people. And over the course of the week, what they're challenged to do to learn how to use the recorder is to take one and then go out on campus and ask people questions, right? Typically, vox pops are done around a certain theme, right? So around New Year's, you would say like, what's your New Year resolution for this year? And then you would sort of get together a list of answers that would show, well, what's UWM's collective New Year's resolution this year? But then, so they're learning how to use the equipment, but then this also became a way for us to talk about how to ask good questions, right? Because if you ask somebody, what's your New Year resolution, you're just gonna get a whole bunch of people lying about exercising and dieting, right? So, but when you interview somebody, what you want to get out of it is you want to get kind of like authentic emotions from answers, right? And you also want to get stories. So as we listened to the examples, it also became an opportunity for us to talk about the kind of questions they were asking. So I had them do, to go out, the broad theme is like you have to ask people like, what is the Midwest, right? And you'll get a bunch of answers that say everything from Ohio to Wyoming, probably, right? But if you ask, the challenge was, is that we talked about their answers, like, well, what if you ask them, what do you think people misunderstand about the Midwest, right? What do you think people miss when they think about the Midwest? Like, what comes to mind? Well, then that elicited more thoughtful responses about the contours of what this thing we call Wisconsin and the Midwest is. So it was a dual purpose assignment where they're both, learning how to use a recorder and learning how to interview somebody too. The other one I've done that's been less successful, but it's also gotten students thinking about how sound is created. It's never just captured, it's kind of manufactured, much like knowledge is have them create soundscapes, right? So if you were to try to capture the audio vibe of this room, what would you record, right? You could just put a recorder in the middle of the room and then just capture the ambient sound, but that doesn't capture the experience of being in that room, right? So for me, if I was doing a soundscape in here, I would put the microphone really close to me because I can hear me really loudly. I'm kind of booming in this room. But also this, the HVAC system is like buzzing in my ears. So I would want to get some sound of the HVAC system and how the kind of sterility of campus classrooms, right? The kind of the plastic and the carpet you find in every university across the country, that you can kind of capture that in the sounds, like the hum of the computers, the hiss of the HVAC, the clicking of the mouse over here, right? I mean, all the sounds that go together to make a space. So I want to play an example quick to sort of show you some of the things that the students have produced. And the challenge was to record a sound that said something. And this is what a student came up with. So what do you think happened?
The mail carrier thing?
Yes, that's exactly right. The student worked at a small apartment on the first floor, and she had the windows open, and then the mail came, and this was a routine that the dog every morning would just go crazy every time the mail came. And so again, this is just a recording, but she was able to capture a sense of movement, right? A sense of like what happened. There's an arc to this. And so it got them thinking how if you want to say something with sound, it takes a little more work different kinds of work than in writing with a paper, right? Because if you want to shift ideas, you can't just put a page break or add a second, a colon, like here's a new section. You have to do that. You have to signal that to your listeners, like when are we changing ideas? So that's the first assignment, just getting them to use the recorder. The next assignment, well, apparently, I accidentally put like a 20-minute tape on here. Now I'm like stuck. There we go. All right, so the second assignment then, so the first one is about using the recorder. The second assignment was then to introduce them to the editing equipment. And in my class, I use a program called Hindenburg, which I'm happy to talk about. But students on campus also had access to Adobe Audition in certain labs, which is sort of free to them to use. So there's a lot of, and then there's some open source ones as well. But the challenge to get them to use the editing equipment is then through a sort of a venue or a genre called the montage. And what this required them to do was to find archival audio, right? So now they're sort of advancing their research process by going and looking at sources that could be used in a podcast. Either oral histories or UWM's TMJ archive is an amazing resource. It's full of sound that they can use. But also getting them to think about dramatically reading primary sources, right? Because if you got a research topic from the 19th century, you're not going to have a lot of sound, right? But if you read somebody's diary, well, then you basically just interviewed that person, is what I would argue, in a way. So they had to go out and find the audio. Then they had to use the editing software. This was an introduction to the editing software. And the result for them was having to put together, again, to create a narrative. Take these disparate pieces of sound and create a story. They could not use their voice. They could not interview anybody. This was solely with raw archival audio that they had to stitch something together that said something. And so here I'll give you an example of what another student did. Nope. Oh, why isn't it working? I'll just play here quick.
President of the United States has spoken to you from the White House in Washington, D.C.
My most immediate concern is in carrying out the purposes of the great work program just enacted by the Congress. Its first objective is to put men and women now on the relief rolls to work, and incidentally to assist materially in our already unmistakable march toward recovery.
Today, depression is a fading memory. Millions of men and women have found employment, and with it confidence and hope. The Great Works program has removed a vast army from relief rolls. It revived lagging industry, restored morale, and renewed courage. In a program which covers the entire nation, Missouri takes an important place. A state state rich in natural resources, Missouri offers a great store of raw materials for construction projects.
The National Recovery Act was stamped on every window. I can still see it, the eagle. And people flocked to work. They didn't do very much sometimes. They hauled gravel in a gallon bucket. But they had work, and they gave work fair. One man in my country, my dad told me, worked. He had a job, he was so proud to get it. He walked 7 miles and worked for the WPA and whatever chore there was. He walked it back at night to feed his family. They were very proud people, you see.
So this was a story who was working on WPA projects in Missouri back at the time I was teaching in Kansas City. And I don't know, this is they're trying here, but what she was hoping to do was to go from this big federal level of something like the New Deal and then bore down to an individual story, right? So we opened with the news, with the president, with some sort of booster material about the state of Missouri, and then an oral history collection that the State Historical Society had done about working for the New Deal in the 30s. And so you get a sense of you're kind of diving deeper and deeper. And again, this was part of her research project. She was doing the Depression era cooking was actually her topic. So this was a chance for her to find materials and then also to lose the software and the equipment she needs to use for the class. And then, I gotta jump through all this here.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Now
the
it works.
President.
All right, so then the last one so if we've done the recording equipment, we've done the editing software. The last one then challenges about the writing, right, which is not a digital humanities tool, if you will, but is probably the most important thing that they can learn in this. And so the challenge was then to think about how to start writing for the ear as opposed for the page. So one of the ways we would do this is by an assignment I called the script. And so what they would have to do is they would have to take a journal article or a book chapter that we had read in this class about Midwestern history, and then translate that into write an introduction to a script about a podcast for it, right? And so it got them thinking about characters, how do you pull a character out of a story? What's gonna be the thread that'll tie everything together? But then again, sort of translating that scholarship into for the ear. And then the last thing is kind of similar to that is a kind of highfalutin academic word called remediation, where I would give them a newspaper article and then say, okay, this was written for the eye, now take it and rewrite it for the ear. All the same information, all the same quotes, but how would you reposition this by making the sentences shorter, by making them more declarative so that it can be processed audially or through auditorially. So, and that I don't have any examples of that because most of them are very long. But just thinking about writing as being a tool as opposed to just kind of an attendant to the class. And so the benefits for me to this, I'll kind of close by talking about then how, what we got out of this, how it was helpful. I could tell you what I love about it, but I thought really just the best way is just to show you quickly. So I'm just going to play you a portion of a student's final project that they were able to do over the course of the semester with these kind of the scaffolding. And we're diving right in the middle here because I want to showcase kind of the strength of the piece. But one of my students last year did the experience of Hmong refugees in Wisconsin during the Vietnam War. So we're diving into kind of the coming to Wisconsin part.
When the U.S. first began accepting people, many refugees were uncertain, but not so for Dow's family.
We heard a lot of rumors about things that could happen in America, bad rumors, but because my brother used to work with the Americans, we knew, and he said, we're going to America, we're not going to stay here. So we made up our mind that we're going to go to America.
The journey of Dow and his family was arduous, but their most difficult choices didn't involve what to bring or where to go.
The hardest part is we know that we're going to leave many of our families behind. We know we're going to miss them, and we don't know if they'll be able to follow us and go to America and be with us in America. That was the hardest, the most challenging decision for us.
Most of the refugees seemed exhausted from all the travel, but managed to smile.
We came to America. We knew nothing about the U.S. and nothing about the U.S., nothing about the different states. All we knew is just Wisconsin.
They speak no English and have almost no education. Their skills are listed as military and farming. They asked to come to Wisconsin, saying they'd heard of it in the camp. It will be an adjustment, but there will be people here to help. Melody Wilson News.
One of these people was Mary Crouch.
I had no idea who they were or where they were coming from, but I always liked to get involved with things.
Mary helps Dow and other refugees get settled in the community.
We ask for rice, and the sponsors, they know what rice is, but they don't know where to get rice.
We have rice there, but not as much as they use. I mean, we buy a box of rice, and they buy 100 pounds.
The next day, they brought a Chinese lady, and then she said, oh, the closest place was La Crosse, and our sponsor then took us to La Crosse.
It didn't take us long to form a really good relationship.
So there's some rough edges, I think, there. I don't know why the plane comes out of nowhere. Like, you know, the guy's talking and then a plane flies over him, so that needs to be set up a little better. The transitions are kind of hard for me as a listener, but, I mean, the student learned about Hmong history. He did that in relationship with the community, right? He got to go out and go to community centers and participate and talk to people. And then now he has a suite of tools and these editing equipment that he can actually go out and apply for jobs with. And actually, he just got his first job in an archive where part of his story is going to be interviewing people who come in and do research in this archive. So it was able to sort of, I'm a historian who can also do these kinds of storytelling. So for me, it was sort of the kind of multi-layeredness is what was so beneficial. And just to wrap up really quick though, I'll just sort of things I wish I knew when I first started this to leave you with. If you're thinking about doing this too. The first I would say is setting expectations right up front. When I taught this last year, a student thought we were just going to listen to podcasts all semester. And it wasn't until like halfway through she realized there were no quizzes or exams, but she would be making a podcast. So kind of on her, but also made me realize that I should be upfront about that too. The next one is this was a lesson I learned the first time that I did differently is I wanted to be the cool professor and let students work on whatever they wanted, but they drowned. Like the thought of finding a research topic and figuring out a recorder at the same time just panicked them. So I gave them a list of topics that I knew had resources on campus they could use, either connected to an expert that I knew they could interview or audio files that I knew they could get access to. So I gave them things to choose from. So that way they weren't starting from scratch because that scared the students. And then the last thing is what they call on radio programs, Jane, you could probably speak more to this, but what are called crits. I thought just getting them to make the podcast by the end of the semester would be an accomplishment enough. But the students actually wanted to get done earlier so they could listen to rough drafts of each other and critique each other. And so that kind of blew me away, that I could sort of scale up or ramp up the production so we had time to do more peer review. Which is actually one thing I'm now realizing I totally forgot to say, I apologize. But in each of these 3 assignments, in addition to turning in the audio, they also had to turn in a 500-word essay saying what it was they were trying to say, right? And then they were paired with a peer review partner who listened to their piece and then read their essay. And so it became, well, this is what you were trying to say, but this is what I heard, right? And so it showed the kind of work you have to do in order to translate the stuff to the ear. So sorry, I meant to say that with the very first one. But that's been sort of the scope of what I've done so far. I've found it wonderfully rewarding. I'm teaching this class again in the fall, and I look forward to it. So if you all have any story ideas, please tell me them that I can send my students to. So thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Just open the floor to questions.
I have a question.
Yeah.
How do you evaluate these?
Yes, that is a very good question. So I evaluate them in a couple of different ways. So I am a big proponent of, let me put it this way, my son plays hockey, and I am a coach on his team, and the only expectation I have for him is to try hard, have fun, get better, and listen to coach. And that's kind of what I expect my students to do, that I recognize that they are not going to produce incredibly high polished pieces of work. But if they're going to fail, I want them to fail with me. And so part of it is rewarding engagement and effort alongside of this. But I do send out a rubric that I can share later that does like, if you're interviewing somebody, you're following the best practices of interviewing by capturing good audio. So part of it is just following the instructions. If you are writing, that you are actually going through multiple drafts and are able to show me that. And one of the things I think we're going to talk about later with Lane is I have kind of an open turn-in system where I create OneDrive folders where they have to keep everything so I can follow the work that they're doing. And so some of it is keeping pace throughout the semester of knowing what we're doing. So, but also in each of these instances, we listen to examples and talk about the best practices other people use, and then I create a list of tricks I expect them to employ in their pieces. So if they turn in a montage with one piece of audio, like that's not a montage, right? And so then they're docked for not following the examples, the outlines of the assignment. But for me, good or bad is subjective, and so I just reward effort is really what I tend to reward. So I don't know if that's helpful at all.
Yeah.
But it.
And do you ever have them work in teams, or is it always individual?
So I've done individual because I want them to, because otherwise if they've done, I mean, they could do teams, but my concern is if they do teams, then they start divvying up the work and only learn part of the process. But they work in pairs in terms of evaluating each other's work. So somebody is familiar with the struggles the other person has throughout the course of the semester. So they can talk to, they have a partner they can talk to because they've got to turn in all their essays to them to begin with. I think for a graduate class I teach that has an audio component to it, I do teams, but that because at the graduate level, creating what I call an audio postcard is a part of a much bigger project where the students work with a place of worship over the course of the semester and write its history, do oral histories, and then do a field recording. And with that many moving pieces, I do partners. But I do think this is something you could do on your own. Like you would write a paper on your own. So I think you should be able to do this on your own, and I want them to know the tools. But because otherwise, somebody would the only person comfortable talking to people would do the interview, and then that's it, right? And then they kind of cash out at that point. And students ask to work on their own. They have they wanna know how to do this so they can say they can do it later. So, yeah.
So along those lines, so they go out into the field.
Yes.
So you assign their topics, and so do you make the connections for them in the field, or how does that work in terms of them knowing what field to go to?
Yeah. So yes and no. So in many instances, so in terms of the topic, it's sort of like a source base for them. And in some instances, the source base is just a collection of audio files. And then the expectation being, I mean, we talk about networking and we talk about how to find interview subjects. So if they're doing something on the civil rights movement in Milwaukee, I don't know any civil rights activists in Milwaukee from the 60s, even though I know they're everywhere. But I do know you can find a historian who has researched on this, and we talk about how to make contact with somebody and say, I'm doing a student project. Could I have 20 minutes of your time to ask you some questions for a podcast I'm making? And then, we cover in class how to record a phone call using the equipment.
So you do it mostly in phone?
Some of it. In other instances, like the student who did the Hmong podcast is my office neighbor is Chia Vang in the history department, who has ready connections to the Hmong community. And I asked Chia if I could put a student in touch with her, and she welcomed it. So the student, as part of the other pieces, Chia is a character in the story, providing kind of the context for Dao's story. So there's audio, that's what I'll say. And then part of the semester is helping them make the connections. It's a part of how do you do professional networking? How do you cold call somebody? But I do try to provide a path into the community. I don't provide a one-to-one relationship, but I do think if they're gonna go there, I need to create a safe route for them so they don't just wander into the open and get themselves in trouble.
So a safe academic route, I mean, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I guess my question is too, in addition, is do you ever worry about a safe physical route to where they're going? You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, in terms of visiting spaces and places they maybe shouldn't?
Yeah. Not necessarily that they shouldn't. The reason I'm asking is because I do a similar project in my class, and I send students into the community and they go and look at public art and things like this.
Yeah.
And sometimes I worry, what happens if something bad happens to them? I'm just
they just get in a car accident on the way or something?
Like that. I mean, do you ever worry about that, or is that ever part of your sort of thinking? Or?
I'm more worried about who they meet and who they talk to.
Yeah.
And so I guess I don't think about transportation that much.
Yeah. That is okay.
I mean, it's kind of, I think, even if you do a field trip, there's a risk to it, right? So no, but I do, I mean, honestly, in the class, the graduate class I do on places of worship in Milwaukee, I'm actually more concerned about that because like, do I want to send them into a neighborhood where they may not be welcome to study this religious community that might not want them there, right? So that,
Those are the questions I
yeah,
have.
so that, in that instance, I do, like, I won't let students work with a place of worship unless I've identified a liaison that will advocate on their behalf as they do the work. So there's a lot more, but that's for the public history program, and there's a lot more community building involved there. In many instances, this is students calling a professor and asking for 20 minutes, is what a lot of this been. And again, I often try to think about who are the experts on campus I can lean on, so it becomes a part of a larger collaborative endeavor. I'll also say too, part of the work that we did in that class is I worked with WUWM, where they hosted us for a day. And told us a little bit about what they did. We used Bubbler Talk as a model for how to do a 3-minute history piece. And Bubbler Talk gave us some of their questions and said, we're happy to help students find people that they want to talk to in the process. But I will say, like, they have to get my permission before they interview somebody, so I know who they're talking to. Like, there's a lower, I mean, there is a heightened level of observation that goes along with this kind of work, but then it fills the classroom space so much effortlessly because we cover the content and then they want to get to how are your projects doing, like who can we talk to, where are you at with this kind of stuff.
I just have to say, it's really cool.
Oh, thanks.
It's really very, very cool what you're doing.
Thank you. I found it rewarding.
That's great.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to know how many students you have and what level of course it was.
Yeah.
And the title of the course.
Right. So the title of the course is Podcasting the Past, Audio Histories of Wisconsin. And it's an upper level undergraduate, so they have to be juniors and seniors to take it. And then it's also open for graduate students as well. And I ended up having the class at 15 students, and it was 50-50 grad, undergrad. Because the grad students know they need these tools to get a job in a museum. Like, they're primed for that. And so one of the things, like a challenge for me going forward, is trying to create space for undergraduates to do this kind of work that then the graduate students don't try to monopolize. It was beneficial the first time I've taught it here, because this is only my third year here, that I was able to pair a graduate student with an undergraduate so they could kind of see, they should see what they should end up like, hopefully, like what they're aspiring towards. And then it taught the graduate students some mentorship qualities as well, that they knew that they were going to work with people who may not be as invested in the material as they are, but they still had to be mentors to them. But my hope is, I mean, I'm very jealous of Jane's class, which is all undergraduates that you're able to kind of do this work with. So.
How specialized is the equipment that the students have to use? I mean, is it a really special microphone and that sort of stuff that they use?
It can be as specialized as you want it to. So I show them kind of industry standard stuff just so they're aware of it, but then of course there's the question of resources on campus. And so I've provided, there's a list of like where the stuff that you can use. The media library here on campus has a number of small handheld Zoom recorders that are okay. It's the equivalent of kind of recording somebody from your phone is really what kind of the quality it is. And also you can have students record on the phone. It's a question of you, how high quality you want it to be. In my class, since podcasts are reshaping how the discipline of history works, I expect a level of production because I know that the field is going to expect that from them, but that's not an expectation you have to have. But then the other thing I'll say too is that the media library also in the last year has invested in a series of actually really good recorders. So they're actually like, I actually meant to bring one and I totally forgot it. But it's a whole suitcase and it has like a microphone and a recorder and a stand when they want to do narration at their home. The DH lab here on campus has a recording studio. Students can check out and go in a recording studio and check. And then the history department just invested in some equipment that our students can use. Because now that they've taken this class, I just had students like, can I take this to Seattle to go interview union activists? And we hadn't thought about travel before. That was a question we had to, do we want these going on planes? So I push quality because if a museum wants them to make this, then I want it to be passable. But if just like getting greater student engagement is the goal, then I think you could, there is a Zoom app, you can download an app on your phone that will record it in as much a quality, or it'll spit out a format that will then be recognized by most editing software that'll be easy to use. And the tools are the same for setting the levels. And you can also just buy attachments that allow you to just stick a nicer microphone right on your phone, and those are like $30. And then you're able to get a little higher quality out of it.
I just wanted to add to that because I work in the journalism department and we've been doing audio storytelling for a long time now, and we use Zoom H2N recorders. They're about $160, $170 a piece, and I know that's a lot, but they've been really durable, and we've been through many years now of replacing them, and even we're really under a lot of strain in a lot of other ways, but these have been fantastic and durable, and we have dozens of them. And students often are so engaged and interested that because I have a unit of audio in the introductory journalism class, they'll go buy their own. And then they'll carry that through, because even $160 or so, they can figure that out.
Yeah, and some of those, for $160, you can really get industry standard stuff, because some of this is what NPR sends to the field, because if it breaks, they're not out $1 million or whatever.
Well, and we publish our stories on our own website. Right. They win a lot of awards.
Yeah.
But aside from that, WWM has taken our student stories, and the quality is terrific from the Zoom H2N.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions? All right.
Well, I want to give us a little bit of time today for the activity that Chris.
Okay, you want to do that?
Yeah, let's do that. And so you'll look on your sheet right there, just to kind of we'll get started, and then you'll do you have it all set?
Yep. Yeah. So I thought Lynn and I talked about doing an actual kind of classroom demonstration. So this is actually an exercise I do with my students, where I'm going to play a clip from a show right now. I don't mind telling you, it's an episode of The Daily. It's actually one Jane, you and I have used before. It was a show they did October of last year when the New York Times got a hold of a ream of state tax returns on President Trump. And it's an introduction, it's the beginning of that show. And so what I want you to pay attention to is, as you listen to it, try to write down the number of sounds you hear, right? Like how many, and what I mean by sounds is, like, if you hear music, that's one track, right? If you hear a narrator, that's another. And so try to keep track of how many tracks are in this little piece of audio. So hopefully this works.
You have to swear an oath of blood before you're allowed in, so. Okay.
It's not been cleaned since we took it over.
Can you just kind of walk me through the piles a little bit?
These are thousands of property records, deeds, and mortgages and transfers on every property ever owned, going back for 60 years.
You've got all these buildings here. There's the house that you owned. And this is an aerial photograph of one of the buildings, I assume?
Right, that's correct. And then there's bank statements, tax returns, detailed accounting records where we can follow where the money's going.
Okay, so I know this has been a sprawling, complicated investigation, but I wonder if you could just boil it down for me. What is the big question that you have been trying to answer?
For all of us, the question always comes back to what's the actual ground truth about Donald J. Trump and how he got rich.
My father gave me great knowledge. Didn't give me a lot.
The famous go-to talking point that Donald Trump says.
I started with $1 million loan. I built a company that's worth more than $10 billion, okay?
Is that his father loaned him $1 million.
It's not been easy for me. It has not been easy for me.
And that he parlayed that $1 million loan into this $10 billion empire.
My father gave me a small loan of $1 million, and I had to pay him back, and I had to pay him back with interest.
This idea that he's a self-made guy.
I built this empire, and I did it by myself.
And when you turn over the rock on that,
nobody did it for me.
It's just wholly untrue.
But there's more to the story than just Donald Trump got more from his father than is previously known.
Yeah, from the documents we gathered, we were able to unearth details about Donald Trump's wealth that he has worked very hard for a very long time to keep hidden.
All right. So I'm curious, how many did everybody count?
I had 6.
I had 6.
6? Which one? Do you want to share? Which one did you come up with? What's your list?
I had the first 2 people entering the room and talking, and then a Trump speech, and I counted this as one thing, and then the narrator over the speech, and then more Trump excerpts, and then the New York Times narrator, and then the interviewee, and then the sound header. But actually, I realized I undercounted because there's a whole bunch of stuff in between there with the excerpts.
Yeah. Does that match what you have?
Not exactly, no, I did a slightly different approach. I just took the voiceover as just one,
Mhm.
you know, okay, that's one track.
Yeah.
Talking. Then I have the door unlocking, and then I hear the people moving around, and then I hear the paper shuffling, and then.
And that was all one, or you counted that as like 3 or 4?
I counted as 3 different things,
Okay.
because it's 3 discrete, I mean, the door
Yeah,
unlocking, and then moving around, very different, and then the paper shuffling, very different. And then all those voice recordings of Trump blathering on about whatever, and then at the very end you had the theme music coming in.
Anybody else have anything radically different? So I had 6 as well. That's kind of what I came out with. And the point of this kind of exercise, what I also often have students do is there a dry erase board?
Right.
Can I use? Oh, is it okay? Can you turn it so I can draw it? The kind of setup I give students before we do this is I'll have them listen to the show overnight and then we can talk about it. And so I tell them to make a couple of axes, one being time, right? So mark it out by 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds, and then another being by track. So then they have to make a list of, okay, oh, here's the door opening, oh, here's music, and then as they listen to it, kind of show me where it shows up, right? And what this does is I end up showing them the software before they even use it, right? Because this is exactly what most audio editing tracks look like. So then before they even see the software, they realize they're thinking about it in their heads. But the other thing it shows them to do is how, in order to create a scene, in order to tell a story, it's about layering sound, right? It's not just about getting a recording, getting the tape you want, and then just going home with it. It's about thinking about crafting this. So I haven't thought about the way you were talking about it, Bill, but I actually think you're right. Because the door open is so clear, they probably went and recorded the door opening later after the fact. Because my 6 was, when you often go and get an interview or create tape, you're told you need kind of 3 times the tape. One is you just need what's called ambient sound. And so that's them walking into the room. It's the people talking about, oh, what are these papers? And you hear the paper shuffling and everything's just kind of live, if you will, right? And then the next thing you need is what's called active tape. And that's where you actually ask somebody a question while they do something active. So that's the moment Michael Barbaro says, can you tell me what this document is? Well, these are all the buildings he owns. So then you have a more direct interview right there. And then the third is the actual, there's another where the cut is, where you can tell Michael Barbaro and this other journalist has sat down in a quiet room at a later time and asked him a serious, focused question, right? Like, what are you doing and why, right? Like it's sort of then the power, right? But that the setup is all through the ambient noise, like, what are we doing here? What are we, like the confusion of the papers then set up the clarity of the journalist reporting, right? And then on top of that as well as in the Trump recorded pieces that get spliced in and the music that are out there. So that's the 6 I came from. And something I just now noticed this time, did you notice how Trump's voice got more and more distorted each time you heard it? Which I didn't pick up on before.
Like reverb.
Yeah, they kept distorting, which I had never picked up on, and it was so what they're trying to convey there is how you can, the value of what he says becomes diminished each time. Like you trust him less and less and less.
That was a little subtle.
Yeah, and I've listened to this. I taught with this several times, and that was the first time I noticed that they messed with the audio in a pattern.
That wasn't quality of the audio like it was.
No, that was them manipulating it. Yeah, right.
It's
I mean, and you could tell if you listen to it with headphones, you can tell that it's not just a bad journalist recording, that it's actually manipulated sound because they're making it sound old timey with the reverb they're adding, like so. But yeah, so that's how and then what we would do is we would have that discussion. It's typically about a piece related to the content we're talking about. And then at the second half of the class would be, all right, well, here's the editing software, and now you guys know how to layer sound in this way. And I think this is kind of deceptively simple. It's not a lot of recordings. There are others. What I often then do is, I don't know if we have time for it. Do you want me to play it?
I mean, I give you 4 more minutes.
Well, maybe I'll just send you to it. You can go find it. Then I often show them this, and I'm like, hey, this is how you create a scene. Is using these elements, and I typically take a very simple show. Actually, one probably simpler than this, a little easier with fewer moving parts, so they can just see how everything connects. And then I say, okay, well, you want to know what they really do to make something powerful. Is I play a clip from a Radio Lab episode, which is another podcast called American Football, and it is the most dramatic 5 minutes of audio I have ever heard in my life, and it has 70 tracks in it, and that's why. Because what they did is they recreated a football scene, so they went and got volunteers to serve as the crowd for the football, so they were cheering, and they were doing the chants from the 19th century that these 19th century football teams would do, and you felt like you were watching this football game from 1893 in your head. Like, it's just dramatic. And I show them, and Radio Lab actually on their Instagram feed posted a picture of that episode, and you can just see that it's like their tracks look like this. Like, it just goes all the way down, like every little different piece of sound that they add in there. And so it sets the expectation that if you want to do something good, like, it takes work. This is not any less easy. It's not more easy than like writing a paper. In fact, it can be kind of harder. But it sort of challenges them to put in the effort to make something good. And they often want to do something good because they listen to this stuff and they want to mimic it and aspire to be it. So.
Do you also talk to them about, like, that Trump one is such a perfect example, regardless, you know, besides opinions of Trump, like what they're doing with the audio to change your perception of what is being spoken, right?
Yes.
You talk about, like, hey, this is what you can do with audio, this is the ethics behind this. What do we hear when we're listening to podcasts?
Yeah. So yes, we do. And a lot of it, oral historians have been talking about this for a very long time, especially when you transcribe oral history. So if somebody has an accent, do you transcribe that accent like literally onto the page? Like, well, no, because they know what that word is, they just happen to speak it differently. So we do something similar in audio, is that if by moving pieces of speech around, if you're changing the meaning of what they're saying, like, that gives me pause, right? But if somebody was like fumbling through a hard answer, said a couple of times, sighed a couple of times, and what should be a 10-second answer takes 30 seconds, you are okay making them sound better and like taking out those ums and ahs, right? Because one, you only have so much time, and you're actually getting more true to what they're saying by cutting out all the stutters and the restarts and things like that. Unless that person's pause is important, right? If they get choked up, about something, and then you splice it out and you miss the fact that they like cried in the middle of the answer, you've done violence to that person's story. And so being true to that. But if they, you know, everybody gets nervous around, I mean, these things are magic wands. They take your stories, they can take you different places. And so there's a certain dynamic you have to measure, that how do you get over the awkwardness if it requires taking out the breaths or taking out the ums or the stutters just to represent them for their actual story, then we do that. I actually play an example, is a total tangent. I was maybe I shouldn't say this. I was on a radio show once with another colleague where my colleague actually struggled with an answer. And it was a pre-recorded show that they then edited and broadcast. They're like, okay, well, we can fix that. Well, they fixed that, my colleague struggling to answer a question, by me talking over her. So like, I totally walked in and mansplained my colleague with like, which was completely two separate answers, 15 minutes apart, but they collapsed them to deal with this audio issue. I'm like, that is not good editing. Like, that is making me look really bad. Because it totally looks like I interrupted her. Like, why? What she's trying to say is, so yeah. So yes, we do talk about it. Sorry.
I need to ask one more question.
Yeah.
Because, you know, I'm me. But do you have students come back to you and say, hey, I'm able to listen to podcasts differently now, or I get something different out of the podcast, or I can hear them with a more critical ear? Do you?
Yes, not often after the fact, but I mean, during the semester, people will come up to me like, hey, did you hear this? Like, did you hear what they just did there? They actually become much more critical listeners when they tell the editing is bad or sloppy. But also, yeah, and I think that's a part of this, is making them critical consumers of the digital content that just now saturates our life. And if they are more aware that these things are produced, they're not natural, they have agendas just like every other piece of content. Yeah, so that comes out during the semester.
So they'd be able to hear that Trump and like, this isn't just old-timey tape. This is them trying to
hopefully
change.
I mean, we don't talk about editing sound in that level of detail. I mean, just getting them to splice pieces of tape together is a challenge enough, not like adding reverb for historic effect. But I mean, at least at a minimum, they're able to recognize that there are several pieces here that are being put together that aren't naturally put together, and it could look completely different. What I've often noticed is they get really attuned to the ethical concerns about, like, that is a bad question for that topic, right? Like, if you are doing that, like, you did not respect that person's story, you did not respect the context in which you're doing the interview, that they get more well-averse to the power dynamics of knowledge production that these shows do.
Awesome. Thank you.
So,
No problem.
Sorry. If you were inspired by today's presentation, which I know I am, it just so happens that the Digital Humanities is doing a series on podcasts and how to do that. So Anne, could you talk to us a little bit about that? Just what's going on in this semester?
Yeah, sure. We're doing a series on sound narratives and bringing in experts from across campus to do several workshops. We did this last fall. So we just had the first one yesterday, which was the first of a two-parter on editing software. We've got one coming up on October 21st that Jeff Loomis from JAMS will be giving. That's actually specifically about the different kinds of equipment that you use. And then Chris and Jane are doing one on how to making scenes and writing stories. So, right, or something like that. And then we have one specifically on interviewing based on journalism styles, and then one on interviewing based on oral histories. And you can find all the dates and times on the Digital Humanities Lab website. So free and open to anybody who wants to come. Students, faculty, staff, everybody. So
Thank you.
Thank
you so much.
Yeah, thanks.
So, thank you all for coming today. Please fill out the evaluations. That's available on the blue sheets right there, just to let us know how we're doing and know what we can do to change to make this better. If you have any comments in your online, I'm sorry I don't have the digital version of this ready yet, but please feel free to send me an email if you have any concerns or things you'd like to have changed. I'd definitely do that. Next week we'll be having Active Teaching Lab again. Tell your friends, bring a buddy. This is always more fun with more people, so please let others know. And then finally, next week we'll be talking about Canvas Analytics with Susan Stolinsky, October 16th. So definitely come in for that as well. So thank you again to Chris for your fabulous presentation today. And have a good week, everyone. Take care.